was a lot of information that was not printed in that piece that I heard, because I talked to these people, that was fucking crazy shit. Personally, he was very manipulative to me. I've seen him fucking angry, like spitting red angry. Like I've seen this personally in him. And I think that someone's character matters. If you're a liar in one field and you're manipulative, like really, really manipulative in one field, why do we assume that he can firewall it off? He is an expert at cherry picking data. Let's say that he's 80% on target. Let's say he's 80%, oh no, this checks out. But 20% is fucking flim-flam, like just got nothing to it. If he's giving you these protocols, how do you know what truth is? I can tell you his cold research sucks. I've heard it's about a $20 million a year sponsorship from Athletic Greens. If you're one of those people who's like, money can influence you, then apply that to Andrew Huberman.
Scott, thank you for coming on to the Apex Energy podcast. How are you doing today?
It's a hectic time, man. I'll tell you what, this piece in New York Magazine came out on Monday, and my internet is exploding, and I can't even keep up with anything that's going on. So I'm frazzled, but fine. Overall, it's fine. Totally fine.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, we'll get into all this stuff. But before we start, do you mind just giving a brief introduction about yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm Scott Carney. I'm an investigative journalist and anthropologist, and I've written a bunch of books. What else do you want to know?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's perfect. And Scott, I really came across your work when I discovered the Wim Hof Method, and I wanted to learn some of the science behind it and all these different things. So you definitely kind of provided a lot of helpful and useful information behind the Wim Hof Method. And I'd like to just start
Sure.
from that story. I'd like to ask you the question, is Wim Hof a cult leader?
What a great question. The reason you're asking, right, is because I wrote this book, What Doesn't Kill Us, which I was one of the first people to ever train with Wim, and I came in there very skeptical of his methods. And then after doing his methods, my feelings about him changed quite a bit, right? I ended up doing a lot of ice water training, a lot of breath work. I ended up climbing up Mount Kilimanjaro with Wim, and I sort of put Wim on the map initially. Like I wasn't the reason why he was super famous, but I was definitely the first real investigative reporter to do anything on him. And from my work, sort of he was on Rogan, he was on Yes Theory, he was on Vice, and he then became this sort of like really important person. And my feelings about the method, like the cold water exposure, the breath work, I think there's some really good things about it. I think there's some very promising B+ science about it. Certainly it's something that I do every day. I did the breath work maybe an hour ago. I do the cold exposure all the time. So it's a big part of my life. But the question you asked is actually very important, which is Wim Hof a cult leader? And I will say that when I had a background of sort of debunking cults before him, like this book over here, The Enlightenment Trap, was all about like me debunking cult leaders and like intensive meditation practices. And when I met Wim, he wasn't famous. Like that, he couldn't have been a cult leader at that point because there were 3 people in that training session. There was no organization. But what I have seen is as he has grown, there's a lot of cult-like dynamics in the organization. There's a lot of like group think going on, and there's a lot of people sadly dying because they're following more insane practices of his method. And do I think it's a cult? If it is, it's not like Jonestown. It's not like David Koresh. It's not like Charles Manson, but it is a cult in a way where people sort of have given their control and their thought processes over to a leader. Yeah, I sort of think it is.
Okay, and what are some of these claims? I know that Wim has, back in the day, and still maybe perhaps gives a lot of claims to his method. Some supported by science, and some stray a little bit off science, I would say. What are some of those claims that he makes, and why would they be troubling to a person who has lots of influence and power?
So there's a, I mean, so the claims that he has made are all over the place. When you put him on a podcast, he just sort of goes and he
Mm,
used science-ish words. And I have not heard all of his claims. I have not listened to all of his videos because there's a lot of videos out there. It's like I did a search on this the other day and it was something like 40,000 videos. Like I'm not going to go through all that
yeah.
stuff. Um, but I've heard him say essentially that his method cures almost everything in one way or another. For instance, there was this famous Dutch astronaut named Bobo Ockels who was dying of cancer, and he went all in on the Wim Hof method and then died. He was training with
Mm,
Wim, and I don't know if Wobo stopped taking his cancer treatments to do the Wim Hof method. I'm not
mm,
part of his medical team, but there is this. He sort of verges on faith healing at times, and which is too bad because there actually is really good, interesting, promising science around the Wim Hof method being able to decrease inflammation, to lower cortisol levels, to possibly attenuate autoimmune illnesses. Like that stuff's there and it's coming up. But I think people sometimes hear those things, and then Wim says stuff like it can cure cancer. He says stuff, or at least gives the impression that it can cure cancer, or he starts saying a lot of sciencey sounding words that actually don't mean anything if you actually
mm,
you take the dopamine synergistic transport pathway, and then you can breathe yourself into your blah blah
yeah.
blah blah. Like
Yeah.
it almost sounds real, but it's not. And Wim has no college education. I don't even know if he has a high school education. He's hung around scientists and he can sort of like yammer with them. But I think
Hmm.
what he does is he gives people hope, and hope is really good and it's really bad. It's really
Mm,
good because hope, positive thinking, like that is, there's all sorts of studies that show positive attitudes um, help health outcomes. And maybe he's found a way to like sort of help the placebo effect plus cold water plus breathwork might have like sort of a resiliency component to it. Sure. But then some people go all the way
mm,
in, and then some people go even take it even farther. So one of the things that I'm really worried about right now is that the Wim Hof method is breath work in theory. Like if you look at how it's written, the Wim Hof method is breath work, cold exposure, and something called mindset. The breath work patterns are honestly they change all the time. There's fast breath work, there's a slow breath work, there's and but it's not actually 100% clear what it is. The cold exposure is you get in the cold water and you relax. I think that's fairly standard throughout what he's done. Um,
mm.
and then there's the mindset, which is it's like the Holy Ghost. Like, what's the mindset? I don't know. No
Yeah.
one's been able to explain
Yeah.
what the mindset is to me. I have an idea because I practice it, but when you say the Wim Hof method, you also might think Wim Hof might know this method, right? When you hear those words, Wim Hof method, oh, it's what Wim Hof teaches, it's what Wim Hof does. And then you end up in this whole world of madness where it involves like singing in groups and doing these like fake Tai Chi moves. And
Mm,
most recently on his winter travel expeditions, it's fire walking, it's placing arrows on people's necks and leaning against them. It's sort of
wow.
growing into this sort of like metastasis of the human potential movement in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, which
Mm.
is so generalized that I don't know what the Wim Hof method is anymore. I'm confused about what it is.
Okay, that's very interesting. So did Wim even create his breathing method and the cold exposure? Is he the first person to discover these things?
Yeah, yeah. Wim is the very first person to breathe or ever touch cold water in history.
Yeah.
Yeah, confirmed. No one had ever actually even touched water before, and
Yeah.
I can't believe that we survived this long as a species without even realizing we could breathe. So we should credit him where credit is due.
Yeah. Okay.
That was
I meant,
sarcasm, as we all know,
yeah.
right? No, there's tons of methods that go all the way back to the Stoics, to the yogis, the pranayama. There's many, many, many techniques out there. Wim Hof method is, if you were going to put it in yogic terms, it's Bhastrika pranayama, and
Hmm.
um, and then there's another one, Subeda Nishisheka Subeda pranayama. There's these two
Hmm.
methods, which are like fast breathing and then retention, that you just combine them and you get the Wim Hof method. He may have come up with his own hyper I mean, he may just have hyperventilated. Like when I was a kid, I used to hyperventilate with groups of kids in a crowd, and we did this hyperventilation thing that we passed out. Like, where it came from, I don't, it's a little difficult to know because actually Wim gives 4 or 5 different explanations for where he found it. He either found it in India after with a rishi. He either found it with Tibetan monks who he's never met, to my knowledge, at least not in the olden days. He's probably met them recently. He says he found it by jumping into ice water and then hyperventilating ice water because it was automatic, and then taking that to land. He said that. He said a lot. Oh, he said he found it after his wife died, and he found it, and he found his breath. His stories aren't even standard. So how am I going to tell you where he found it? I can say that people have been doing cold exposure. There's the hydrotherapy that in the 30s. There's Porfiry Ivanov in the 80s. There's a French guy who I forget his name off the top of my head who also did this. The Stoics did it. Nietzsche did it. The Nazis had a big cold water practice. So like, yeah, a lot. Yeah. And actually that's why it's interesting in the late 18s to about 1930-ish, cold water bathing was actually popular in America and sort of around the world. The Nazis glommed onto it and they're like, yeah, this is great. We can, some German words for how to like go interact with nature, because the Nazis had like this whole nature vibe thing that going on too. And then I think what happened is that in America, it dropped right off because Nazis. And it took many, many years for it to sort of get a different vibe in the States. And Nazis are terrible people. Whether or not cold baths are good or not, it doesn't reflect on who picks it up, right?
Yeah.
But I think that is actually one reason why in America there was this lag after the 40s, where we weren't really doing it, but it was still somewhat popular in Europe. And then Wim is like the modern incarnation. He's the modern ice bath guy who is now being replaced by Huberman and Susanna Soberg. So he's actually sort of on the way out. Like I think he's not actually going to be that. I think his group might have peaked and it's going to level and go like that.
Wow. Interesting. Interesting. I mean, I used to be a big Wim Hof fan. I think I still am. When I see him on his videos, he does give a very strong sense of positivity and hope. And
Sure.
that did help me out a lot in my life. But I don't think that would be also a reason for me to just kind of blindly believe whatever a person says. I mean, he's still a fallible human being that makes mistakes. And from what I've seen and from everything you've presented, he is kind of crazy. I mean, you can say that in a good way or in a bad way. But yeah, the truth about it is we have to see the truth. We have to take off these rose-colored glasses and stop seeing him or worshiping him as a guru, like a lot of people do. And I don't think that does him any benefit either, because that just gives him too much power for his ego.
To be honest, when I first met him, I thought naively that endorsing Wim and being like, this guy's great, like look at this crazy guy and this ice work, it's so good and inspiring. I sort of thought that his obvious insanity would prevent people from being like, I want to be like Wim. Like and this was like really just part of my whole like thought process around him was that, look, he's got this big bulbous nose from years of alcoholism. He gave himself a near fatal enema when he sat on a fountain and almost like eviscerated all of his intestines. Like the dude is like crazy. Like you hear him on podcasts, you're like, oh, right. Like most people can feel that vibe. But I think that also there's this tradition called crazy wisdom in sort of the Buddhist Hindu world. The idea of like the insane person who has knowledge to give. And I think a lot of people have sort of taken a spiritual path with him and are like, no, but Wim has deep wisdom. And, there is some wisdom there. I'm not saying there's not. I actually really like so much about Wim Hof.
Same.
But the way that we get social media, framing him in little clips of enthusiastic bites, and the very carefully manicured Wim Hof, who's on his, he has his highs and his lows, right? He has his I don't know if he's manic depressive, but there are sort of like that or bipolar, but I know he has those like, wow, so much fun to be around. Like a manic person, you love being around them. They're actually really fun. Robin Williams, when he was fun, he was freaking fun. And Wim, I think what you see is you see Wim on his upside all the time. But Wim's downside is rough. Like having seen it several times, I'm like, whoa, like it's not like you've been around depressed people. You don't like,
Yeah.
they're not fun. And you're like, oh, there's problems. But when we can carefully manage an image, when we have like a group of video minstrels following around, he has like this whole video team around him. It's a
Mm.
very carefully constructed thing that's not a whole person, like we all are on social media. Like I'm not showing, we're talking in front of my books, right? And you're talking in front of
Yeah.
your fancy artwork,
Pictures.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So we are curating audience. We're curating a version of ourselves that we want to present to the world. Shock, no big deal in some ways. But when you become someone who's huge, um, and you only curate this positive side, not seeing that negative side, and then honestly, the organization does some really bad things to hide
Mm.
that negative side and
Mm.
harass people who present it and threaten to sue and threat various things. Then you start going down this dangerous path where you're only presenting flim flam, and that's a problem.
Wow. Tell me a little bit about Inner Fire, which is the organization that Wim and his sons and his family is a part of, and them sort of not giving very strong warnings against hyperventilation, which is
Mm-hmm.
one pillar of the Wim Hof method, as you mentioned earlier, as well as combining that with being in cold water.
Yeah.
And just tell me a little bit about how they haven't been giving strong warnings, and in some scenarios Wim himself has condoned combining those two practices, which is dangerous and could lead to something we call shallow water blackout, where a person passes out within the water and they drown. So let's start with that.
Well, so this is actually a very complex issue, and I really thank you for asking that question. So first of all, we're just put this out there. There are warnings on his website. There are warnings underneath, I think, just about every Wim Hof video in big
Hmm.
capital letters. Do not practice this in water. He even has a safety video, which is actually pretty good if you watch it. So there are warnings out there, but the problem is that what is the Wim Hof method? Is it what Wim does, or is it what you read on the text of a website? And Wim is first got famous for doing circus acts, essentially like stunts. And one of his first stunts was him swimming underneath ice water, um, for like and getting a Guinness Book of World Record with like a sheet of ice above him. And to do that, he hyperventilated before he did his thing and swam under the ice water. He did it twice. The first time he actually passed out underwater because he was hyperventilating, and
Hmm.
he had to get rescued by a rescue diver. And then the second time he got this world record. And so his presentation is often about pushing past limits. It's often about his even subtitle of his book is Push Past Perceived Limits on his first book,
Hmm.
Becoming the Iceman. It's this idea of going out there, doing big things and showing how Superman you are, right? On the other side of his message is that this is a wellness technique that will help you cure your illnesses, cure anxiety and other things. And those messages are conflicting on the face of it. Because if you see a video of him, if you see him on the BBC swimming under ice water, so they repeated this stunt, hyperventilating and swimming under ice water, and then and then someone says, this is like taking health advice from a man in a caftan, quote. You start to get this confusion about what the Wim Hof method is. And then in his paid courses, he'll do things like, this is the method. And he hyperventilates and he goes into the water with another dude. He's teaching them like the breathing method. This is a $100 course that you buy to learn his method, which you take alone on your computer because that's what we take video courses. And he's literally hyperventilating in water. He describes hyperventilating in water, and then he hyperventilates in water and puts his face in the water, and everything's fine. It's totally fine. He survives and whatever. And there's a warning next to it that's saying, if you hyperventilate in water, you will die. So what Wim is doing right now is not hyperventilating water, which is just a contradictory message.
Yeah.
So this is a real issue because hyperventilating water is incredibly dangerous. And here's the chemistry behind it. So one thing that people notice is that you can hold your breath for a really long period of time when you do hyperventilation. Exhale, hold your breath. You can hold your breath for a really long period of time. The reason for that is that when you detect in your body the reflex to breathe, your body is not detecting, your mind is not detecting oxygen levels. It's detecting the buildup of carbon dioxide in your lungs and bloodstream. So when you hyperventilate, you blow off all your carbon dioxide. And the reason you're able to hold your breath longer is because it just takes longer for that CO2 to build back up after you've hyperventilated. On land, if you're lying down, no biggie whatsoever. However, you can get into a situation very easily. Like I could lead you through a breathwork pattern right now. In 15 seconds, I can get you dizzy and you'll be like, whoa, I can do that. It doesn't even need to be 50, 60 breaths. You can do it in like 6 breaths. You can get into this point where your O2 levels are so low, and actually O2 is normal. Your CO2 is so low that you don't hit that gasp reflex at all, and you pass out before you even feel a single sensation that you're about to pass out. This is incredibly dangerous if you're flying an airplane, driving a car, or most notably, swimming in water. And Wim is always swimming in water. It's so confusing to people. And not everyone, many you listener right now are saying, oh, I do the Wim Hof method all the time, and I would never think about doing water. Awesome, cool, you got the message. But he is spreading this out to his 3 or 8 million followers on social media, and people are dying in droves. I have 32 death reports of people who have died in water doing this, and it usually goes something like this. I mean, all the reports are different because every case is different, but it's like, hey, mom, I'm going to go hyperventilate in water and do the Wim Hof method. Will you time me? No, I can't time you right now. Okay, see you later. And then the person's dead like 5 minutes later. Like over and over and over again, I get stories like that. We have CCTV footage, like it's like well recorded. There's lawsuits about it. This is a huge problem. And Interfire's response is basically, hey, we've got warnings on our website. And because of this situation that I just explained, I'm very public right now and very unpopular. Leave a horrible comment on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I'm used to them.
Okay. I'd just like to mention that I actually, in my peak of being into this Wim Hof method, I actually did the hyperventilation and went under the water, not knowing about shallow water blackout. So that could have been me easily. I was alone, and I've done it multiple times. So, yeah, that's just another example that these warning labels might not be enough. And you've also presented evidence of Wim himself doing it with a group and something he calls a baptism. So there's video evidence of him doing it with people in a group. So obviously, everything you're bringing up is very important. Obviously, it could save a person's life. And I know you do get a lot of hate. I've seen the hate comments and stuff, but yeah, I just want to let you know it's important work you're doing because it's in line with the truth and it could save a person's life. So
it
yeah,
has. It 100% has, because I have people emailing me all the time. Not every day, but like quite frequently, saying, oh my God, I was doing hyperventilation in water for years. Thank you for saving my life. And the thing is, like Laird Hamilton says, it's like playing Russian roulette. You might do it once, you might do it twice, you might do it 100 times and never have an issue. But when that issue comes up, you're dead. And here's another terrible thing. Even if you have a spotter with you, even if you have someone who is watching you, if you take in that lung full of water and are passed out, you generally do not respond to CPR. And this is because you've blown off all like so much oxygen, so much CO2. You've done a max breath hold underwater. You're full of lungs. The current CPR strategy, right, is you no longer do breathing into the mouth. You just do staying alive on someone's chest. So you actually don't have any oxygen to circulate in the blood. So time and again, these people, even if they're pulled out and resuscitated, they don't actually come back. So that's another danger on top of this.
Okay. Before we move on to our next topic, I just want to kind of put a bow on this. What's your final consensus on Wim and his character and his organization and his method? You said you use his method, you do the Wim Hof breathing, you do the cold exposure, and you're a proponent of him in some sense. Obviously you've written about him. That's on ink. That's already out. People can go ahead and buy it and read it. But with this conflicting stuff, what's your final consensus on him?
Take the method ditch the messenger. Like, why do we need to have cults of personality at all? Like, why do we need that figure to lead us through something which, like, what he is good for is getting you motivated to do something. And if you do
Mm.
that and you do sauna, you do cold breath work, whatever, like that's all great. But like, why do we have to become fanatics? Like, why is it that we have to take something good and then wring every piece of value out of it until it is a dry husk of nothing, and then
Yeah.
ask for more? Like, we're asking too much of Wim. We're asking, like, and we've made him a star, and it's not just him, it's also the company. The company is worth like $18 million. They have these, they're promoting a story which is just not true about Wim over and over again, like,
Mm.
building up a myth, building up a mythology, becoming very almost culty, becoming very religious. And hey, anyone can make a living. Like, I get it. Like, it's not, they can make money, like, cool, like, whatever. But they're doing it in a way that is not the truth. And I
Mm.
feel like I don't know. I'm just sort of like somebody who really cares about the truth. And I think a lot of people don't care about the truth anymore. And that's an existential crisis for me, because I'm like, no, the like truth matters. Like, you don't just be loyal to someone because you liked them at one point. Like, you can be
Yeah.
like, oh, I was loyal to you at one point. I thought this was interesting. I thought this was genuine. But when they go off the rails, you can feel like, I don't need to follow you. And I just wish people would leave him alone. I
Mm.
wish they would be like, stop putting him on a pedestal, because it's not good for his health. It's not good for the community's health.
Yeah.
And yeah, the whole thing makes me so sad, because I was his number one follower. I did 300 interviews on the media. I was on TV. I was on all these podcasts. I wrote a New York Times best-selling book. Like, I am
Mm.
fucking Team Wim, until it's like, oh shit, look where we've gone.
Yeah. And then one more thing I'd like to add on is you were, yeah, like you were saying earlier, one of the first people you originally were going to go try to debunk him, right? You
Mm-hmm.
were in 2014, I think you were going to go visit him, try to
2013, yeah. Mm-hmm.
2013, you were trying to debunk him. He was a snake oil salesman. Turned
Mm-hmm.
out it was not that. Actually, there was some
Mm-hmm.
substance to his technique. So people were shocked. People were attracted to it. And now when the opposite happens, when you're still doing your job, the same thing that you did 2013, people criticize you for, unfortunately. It's
Yeah,
fascinating subject. Yeah,
my
go ahead.
theory about this is that the internet works on the same. Have you heard, like, in stand-up comedy, or if you're familiar at all with comedy theory, there's this
Mm,
game that comedians play called Yes and. Okay, whereas you get onto stage with another comedian and you just build your story bigger. So someone says something insane, and then you begin, yes, that's, and this also happened, and it blows up into a bigger, like, sort of crazier story. That concept of yes and is also what happens on social media and with the algorithms too. Is that when you
mm,
say no to something, you're sort of saying, hey, let's pull back, let's take some caution here. And but yes, and which is where viral things happen. Oh, I saw your crazy video, you did a crazy thing, and then I come onto your podcast and I say, yes, that's true, and aliens are controlling my mind. And they're like, yes, and they're controlling Bigfoot. And like, you sort of like get into this like sort of like buildup
yeah,
of craziness, versus
interesting.
somebody coming in there and be like, no, actually, like, let's talk about truth. Like, let's not go down the rabbit hole. That doesn't go viral. That
Mm,
doesn't keep people engaged to just keep scrolling to the next reel. So
yeah.
there's a problem. It's not Wim's problem. It's actually the way we consume and distribute and popularize information on the
Mm,
internet. And that's an issue, because it drives everyone to be radical, and it actually disincentivizes. Your video will not do well, right? Your video, if you're talking rational about this, your video will not do well. Your video will do better. You will be more famous and more rich if you're like, no, I mean, yes, Wim is amazing, and whatever else.
yeah.
Everyone should get 6 proctology exams a week. Like, boom. Oh, really? Like, that's actually how the world moves information today.
That's fascinating, and I am going to look into that more, and into comedy theory and the yes and stuff. Let's move on right now to a topic that's related. That you recently made a video about Dr. Susanna Soberg, who I was I was a big proponent of, honestly, because of her cold water stuff And
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier that Wim is kind of fading out into the black in popular health. And we have these new people that a lot of people look up to, including myself, like Dr. Susanna Soberg and Dr. Andrew Huberman, because they kind of cover this stuff with science. Now,
Yeah.
I want to ask you, what are some issues and what were some red flags about Dr. Susanna Soberg as a whole, as a scientist, and how? Yeah.
Yeah. So I did a whole video on this. I forget what it's called, but it's like Susanna Soberg's Bad Science or something like that. Go on my channel
Mm.
and watch it. Because I'm going to talk to you now, and I'm probably going to get some details wrong because I'm not sitting right in front of my notes. But
Yeah.
essentially, what it is she is uh, does have a PhD. She has done actual research on brown fat. She does seem like know the scientific method. There's no there, that's she's got credentials. She's worked for Novo Nordisk. In working on the weight loss drugs that are now like these billion-dollar things. She has like this
Mm.
background. Her science is on brown fat. So she did this one article in Cell Reports Medicine, which is a very respected journal, about cold water exposure, where she studied 8 winter swimmers and a control group of non-winter swimmers, and then put them into cold exposure and studied their brown fat activation. Now, brown fat, for people who are not aware of it, it's a thermogenic tissue that humans and many mammals have, which sucks white fat from your body to burn directly for heat energy. So the word fat is a little confusing for folks, but essentially it's like a stove in your body that uses to generate heat. And it's been the investigation of many weight loss drugs and weight loss pathways for
Mm.
at least 20 years. So Susanna Soberg studies winter swimmers to essentially be like, well, what is brown fat activating? How are winter swimming? How is that practice beneficial to activate brown fat? All pretty good questions. Her study was very small. It had 8 participants and a control group of 8. The 2 groups were actually sort of morphologically different. The non cold water swimmers were actually much fatter. They had
Yeah.
6% more body fat, not 6% more than the other group, but like one was like 21% body fat and the other was 15% body fat. That's morphologically, you can visibly see the difference in a
Wow.
person when they have that.
Mm.
And then she studied them with thermal cameras, which is not the best way to study brown fat. You actually should do a PET scan. And then she also did a PET scan in a sort of a different environment. Her study looks really good if you scroll through it. Like if you open
Mm.
up her study and you just flick through it, you're like, oh, this looks good. There's some pictures, there's all the things, there's actually pretty good like literature review section. Like there's a lot to be
Mm.
said for it. But I'm not saying and. This is my problem. And it's great, and you should go buy her $2,000
Yeah.
cold water program. But but the problem is that it's an incredibly small study with 8 people, and she took when some of the people she was studying didn't have the responses that she wanted to their brown fat didn't activate enough. She removed them from her statistical group. She's like, you suck. You don't have enough brown fat, so I'll take you out. So that's
Wow.
skewing her results.
Mm.
And she also notes in that her brown fat when she ran a PET CT scan and to look at how many calories were being burned, she was like, oh my God, these people are burning 1,000 to 2,000 calories a day doing this cold water exposure. Wow. And then she has this line saying, interestingly, all the other previous research on this says you should only
Mm.
be burning 20 kilocalories a day. So weird. And then she sort of goes on. But like that's a huge fucking red flag. Like if you're like, my results showed, in my results with 8 people, which I've already juked the results, showed that brown fat is 5,000% more effective than anyone else had studied before. You would think that would be like, maybe we should maybe my instrumentation was a little off. Maybe I have some other issue there. But she just like runs with it. And
Wow.
that's a super weird thing that should not have gone through peer review, in my opinion. And so then she does these results. The results come out, and there's some other issues with her paper, but let's just leave that all to the side for now. Then she immediately leaves science and starts selling a $2,500 watch me swim course, and I'll teach you how to swim in cold water course, where she is getting lots of people. She's on the Huberman Lab podcast. He promotes her. He first talks about her on Rogan, and then whatever. He calls her the best scientist on brown fat working today, and like hardly. She's written 2 papers on brown fat. There are thousands of scientists working on it. She is by far the most junior of them, but she's pretty and she's got a great Instagram feed. And she's now shilling her course, and that's a fucking direct conflict of interest. Like if I do science and then I say, "Hi, I did a research study on my supplement, and my supplement will cure your erectile dysfunction.
Hmm.
Buy this, it'll get," like whatever. Like it's just so she went directly from a scientific paper that looked good into direct to consumer sales, and that's a problem. That's a huge red flag. And I think that we have to be very, very careful about influencers posing as scientists and people using very small studies, very problematic studies, uh, even if they're published in a journal, even if
Hmm.
they're published in a respected journal, to to use that to launch a social media career. Like how can people not see that's an enormous problem?
Okay. So the from what I understand, her claims were that you could lose a lot of weight, like you said, up to 5,000% more than previous studies done on BAT, brown adipose tissue. So she's basically claiming that you can lose weight through cold exposure. And those results, and I read some of her paper that you mentioned, she said that there could be no something analogous to she couldn't conclude or that she should approach this data with caution, right?
4 times in the
So
paper, she's like,
yeah,
this might not be right. Approach it with caution.
yeah. So that's really interesting. How does that line up with other studies? For example, you interviewed Dr. Otto Music from Wayne
Hmm.
State University,
Hmm.
who's actually done a famous experiment on Wim Hof himself.
Hmm.
How does you spoke to him? How does he see this, and how does he think of a claim like that?
Oh, he says it's I had the text message. I could pull it up right now, but that would take
Yeah.
a few seconds. He basically says it's a clear conflict of interest. People just like shocking results, and it's
Wow.
funny when he studied people and showed that they burned 20 calories a day, and she showed they burned 1,000 to 2,000 calories. I think that's what I
Yeah.
think. You can check her claim. I may not be right. It might have been 500 to 1,000 calories. It might be 1,000 to 2,000 calories. He just said that's basically that's bullshit, and she cited his paper. She was like, interestingly, the previous studies didn't show this, and he was like, yeah, that's crazy, because I do careful research and I'm not selling a course, so maybe look at me a little more
Wow.
seriously. And I
Yeah.
think it's very important to note that the pharmaceutical industry has a enormous reason to find a drug that will activate brown fat. Like they are very into it. There's an NIH initiative on brown fat. They've been pumping at it hard for at least 20 years,
Hmm.
and they have not found one that has been effective. That's really, really important to just keep in your mind, because we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars have gone in to
Yeah.
brown fat research, and we have not found a way to make it actually useful. How did Susanna Soberg suddenly make it so great? Like this one time paper, she has done 2 papers on brown fat. Um, uh, how did she magically find it where no one else did? It's really problematic. Which is
Hmm.
not to say, here's another crazy. It's not to say that you shouldn't cold water swim. It's not to say you shouldn't do this stuff. There are benefits. If you read her newsletter, though, I get it all the time now because I subscribed, and she says things like, "How will cold water, help your fibromyalgia?" Like, I don't know. Do you have
Wow.
a study on that? No, she has no study on that. Maybe it's useful. But like what they do, what they all are doing, Huberman, Susanna Soberg, and I guess to some degree Wim Hof, is you find a study that's tiny, that's like small and maybe even promising. Okay. And maybe the
Hmm.
science was even done well, but maybe it wasn't done well. Could have been either way. But it's like 16 mice agree that this intervention will be great, but you're not studying on humans, or you're studying on 3 humans. Like have we just forgotten how science is done or how we're supposed to evaluate evidence? Like, would you take a drug that was tested on 3 mice and just like, let's go, or three people and just say, let's go? Like, well, I mean, I guess we do that with supplements all the time, right? I guess we do
Yeah.
that all. But should you do that? Like, should you like just like see hopeful science and then say go for it? Because there's so many science directions, so many papers over so many years that just don't go anywhere. We also have a huge scientific fraud problem
Hmm.
where like Dana Farber was just found for faking data in 9 papers. That's Dana Farber. They're a big freaking company. That's the Jimmy Fund. Like that's a huge thing. And like what we care about ultimately are results. And a lot of these people are looking at mechanisms. And mechanisms don't always lead to results because we don't always get the mechanisms right because the body is so freaking complex. Like if I find one pathway, the brown fat activation pathway, it doesn't mean we know how that interacts with every other pathway. And
Hmm.
also, I feel like having been an ice bather for 12 years now, 11 or 12 years, I have noticed that I don't see a lot of really thin ice bathers. Like there are a few, but I think actually what might happen is the body has two ways to deal with cold water. Like your body doesn't want to die. Okay. So you get into ice
Hmm.
water, your body's like, hey, let's not die. And there's two basic ways to deal with that. One, you can ramp up your energy expenditure. Maybe it's brown fat, maybe it's cellular motion, maybe it's muscle motion. I don't know, shivering, whatever. You ramp up energy production so you generate more heat so you don't die. The other way to survive is to conserve heat, which is like vasoconstriction. So you put all the blood in your core and your extremities get cold, and insulation, where you build fat. You actually build fat. Like how many animals, when you look up into the polar regions, how many thin animals are up there? I'm not a zoologist. Maybe there's a ton, but the ones the marquee creatures are
Or
all
fat.
fat.
Yeah.
And I think, and this is not scientific based, I don't have a study. This is observational, anecdotal evidence. So
Yeah.
flag it for flim flam if you want. But I think what actually happens is that maybe when people first start doing cold water exposure, they have an energy increase that happens. But if you do it regularly, I think what actually happens is you start insulating yourself and you actually
Hmm.
retain and slow down your metabolism so that you can sort of retain more heat.
Yeah.
I think that's what happens because I see like the bodies of people and look at Wim Hof right now. Look at a
Yes.
recent video of Wim Hof when he's jumping off his fountain. And then ask yourself, is he thin or is he not thin?
Hmm.
I don't know, maybe you could edit now a photo into when we do this, we could do edit
Yeah.
and put it right here.
Yeah,
Wim
yeah,
Hof,
yeah.
and
I'll
just
put it
like
in.
morphologically, what does he look like?
That's a really interesting point, and it's going back to what you were saying, how you can't take a small sample size, come up with a mechanism and extrapolate that long term. Obviously, that's not how the human body adapts and changes
Mm-hmm.
to things. So these are assumptions, but they're presented as complete fact. Just because there's a little
Mm-hmm.
science behind it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. So long-term trials, longitudinal studies, right, are
Mm-hmm.
required to absolutely know the facts. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like
Okay.
promising science, like this is the constant problem. Like we all want to be open to new ideas. You don't want to just be a
Mm,
person who's like, fuck it, like it's all bullshit. Like that sucks because we know that we don't know everything. We can't assume that we
yeah.
know everything right now. And we want to be open to trying things before the science totally figures it out. I get that, and I am in that. I wrote books about that. I do push the limits. But we also want to have this other mechanism to coming in and be like, let's just wait and be sure. Like let's
Mm,
maybe try something and be like, maybe let's just wait for the longitudinal data. That's how you get longitudinal data. You do it for a long period of time. Uh, but don't think that we have the answers. Try something and maybe you're on the wrong path and you need to be honest about that at all times, brutally honest. And you don't just do one mouse study and then sell a $2,500 course.
yeah.
Like that is not the way we should work as intellectually honest people.
Okay. What's your opinion about Dr. Soberg's claims that brown fat, BAT, is plastic and that with more cold exposure, so brown fat, for people who don't know, or BAT, something we have a lot of when we are infants. Babies have a lot of brown fat, but it gradually declines as you age. And in adulthood, a lot of people don't have that much brown fat. And I've heard these claims from Dr. Soberg on Dr. Huberman's podcast about her saying that it's actually incredibly plastic, it's incredibly rich in mitochondria, and that the more you do cold exposure, you're going to increase the amount of brown fat, obviously, because your body's going to say, hey, we need more brown fat to thermoregulate. And because brown fat is so rich in mitochondria, it's going to contribute to metabolic health. This is an idea I've actually told people because was really convinced of it from Dr. Soberg. What are your thoughts on that claim?
I mean, I was convinced of this too in my book, What Doesn't Kill Us. Like I talk about, there's brown fat and there's also recruitable beige fat. Brown fat, as I understand it, and again, I'm a journalist. I'm not a metabolic PhD. Big caveat here. Just so you know, I just read a lot of stuff and I do this stuff. But, whatever. That's also what Susanna Soberg does too.
And exactly.
So as I understand, brown fat is what babies have, and the recruitable tissue is called beige fat, which is the stuff that you can supposedly recruit. And I wrote about that in What Doesn't Kill Us. And you might be able to recruit it. Honestly, I don't really know what the major difference is. When I talked to scientists about this like 5 or 6 years ago, they were like, it's basically the same thing, but it looks a little different. But when Wim Hof was tested, now, this is actually super interesting. Science got so lucky with Wim Hof because Wim Hof, participates in stuff, and he has an genetically identical twin, a twin brother. Isn't that great? Science is like, woohoo, all right. So, and his twin brother is a truck driver who sits in a cab all day and doesn't do much cold water exposure. So scientists took him into a lab and studied him in a PET-CT scan, which is the scan the best scan that we have to study brown fat. And you would assume that if you take the guy who is the cold water dude and the guy who's a truck driver, you would assume that the guy who's the cold water dude, if brown fat is recruitable, would have a lot more brown fat, right? There's your hypothesis that they tested. And they tested them, they put them both into PET-CT scans, and guess what? They had the same amount of brown fat activation. So that would indicate, and I think it was a high level of brown fat. I think it was higher than normal, as I recall. But it's funny, when I talked to Otto about it, Otto Music, he said that Wim didn't have a lot of brown fat. So I'm confused. I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I will say that when they are the same amount, the theory, the hypothesis that you can recruit more of it by cold water exposure seems to be false, at least in that case. And that's what I can say, because honestly, I don't know for sure. I know that it sounds good. I know that I know that people like hearing that they can change and that they're not restricted by their genetics. And I can also say that I can hang out in ice water for 30 minutes at a time and be okay. And I can get out and I go into a hot tub shortly thereafter. But I can survive at 30 minutes in ice water. I don't think I did that at first. So I don't know if it's brown fat. I don't know if it's another metabolic. I mean, you have multiple ways to heat yourself. Like, it doesn't have to be your magic tissue, right? Oh, I have a magic thermogenic stove. Well, what if it's, I don't know, digestion that does it? What if it's some sort of muscle movement that I'm not detecting? What if it could be a lot of things. I can say that you do build resistance in cold water, and I can be effective in cold water for a long period of time, but I am not going to tell you what the mechanism is, because I think that's the fetish that we all fall for. I think we all fall for it's almost like a religion. Like, oh, well, I can say 18 sort of Latin sounding words like the Catholic Church, and then you're gonna be like, oh, you know the truth. And like, it ain't that way.
Yeah. It's I hate to use the word, but scientism, almost the religion of science, and just using persuasive language. Maybe back in, 1,000 years ago, if you used religious Christian sounding language, people would have fallen for what you're saying. If you incorporate God into it, it sounds spiritual. People will have fallen for it. But today, it seems that science is the paragon that people look up to. And obviously, people are going to turn that into a religion as well. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And you can make anything science sounding and make it sound convincing, and people will buy into it. And I know this is a thing, but I put trust into people like Dr. Susanna Soberg and Dr. Huberman
Hmm.
because I know that they're experts doing the work, interviewing all the experts. So I just kind of had more trust, or I still do, I would say, in a lot of these people. But as we'll talk about more, maybe that could change. But that's something to note for sure. Just tell me a little bit more about, if you don't mind, Dr. So Dr. Otto Music he's a professor at Wayne State University. He did an experiment with Wim Hof. I saw that interview. He said that Wim did not have that much BAT. He didn't have that much brown fat. He said he could have grabbed a person off the street and they would
Hmm.
have more brown fat, right? So that completely goes against this hypothesis that brown fat is the key
Yeah.
mechanism in cold exposure. Yeah. So what does he think? Do you remember what he think? How does the body heat itself up? I mean, I know you kind of said through shivering, but
I
what
think
is he? Yeah,
as I recall with talking with Otto, and again, it has been a little while since I did that interview, so it's
yeah.
probably just better to listen to that interview. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
but I think that I think he thinks that it's just sort of like a placebo thing. I think he thinks that it's sort of like, oh, you just sort of train your mind to turn off, and then you were going to survive anyway because your body has these automatic mechanisms. I
Hmm.
don't know if he, I don't know if he lined up on a mechanism. I think that one thing that he said in one of his famous papers about Wim is that the Wim Hof method and yoga and exercise and all of these things may activate pathways that are the pathways for the placebo effect. Like
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
doing practices that are sensationally loud, right? So
Hmm.
exercise, like, and I'm talking about your sensory system, just like, oh, that's a loud signal, and then having some mental modulation to it, like saying, oh, I have a loud signal, and I can decide with my mind whether I'm going to run away from this stimulus or run into it, like parasympathetic or sympathetic, a fight or
Hmm.
flight, rest and digest. Maybe that is actually one of those key pathways for how the placebo effect works in general in the body. And I think
Wow.
that's sort of where he's going. And I believe that when you look at Wim Hof's promotion of the auto music study, he's like, I have the power of the placebo. When you ask Otto about it, he's like, yeah, he can do it. He's got this Austrian accent. Yeah, he can
Yeah.
do it, but everyone can do it. It's in everything. And like so it's like there's two different conversations going on. And I think that honestly, we just need more study. We need to do more trials on wellness type ideas,
Hmm.
practices, things that are generalizable, that might affect many types of things, that you realize that you can't actively control for a mechanism. Like when you realize that actually maybe, because science is really good at reductive. Like, let's go find one variable. Like, this is why
Hmm.
pharmaceuticals are great. You take a pill, so the only thing that's changed is you had a pill or you didn't have a pill, and then you can see
Hmm.
how that mechanism played out over time. So it's one thing that you're studying, and so that's. I mean, it's hard to do a good trial, but it's at least simple intellectually to figure out if that was the thing working or if that was not the thing working. When you're
Hmm.
talking about ice baths or sauna or talk therapy or whatever else, you have so many variables coming in that it's impossible to control, which doesn't mean those things don't work, right?
Hmm.
Logically, those things could work to do things, but it also says logically that it's really, really hard to say for sure through the reductive scientific method. So we need to find other ways to develop reliable scientific trials, another standard of evidence that then can be accepted among the scientific community. Like that's the really important part, because otherwise what you end up is in flim flam land, where someone
Yeah.
sees a study and then they generalize, they see a reductive study and then generalize it to the whole wellness movement. And then they sell you athletic greens for a subscription of $100 a month. And this green shake is going to make you better because there was a study done once, which is
Hmm.
bullshit.
Hmm. Okay, one last thing I will mention before we move on to the next topic is you have a video that I was really interested in. I think you released it maybe like 7 months ago or something like that, about cold exposure potentially suppressing tumor growth. And you talked about this study that was published in Nature, how these
Yeah.
rats were
Right.
taken at different, I think, three different temperatures, and they
Mm-hmm.
measured
Mm-hmm.
their tumors. They found that the colder the temperatures got that the
Right.
rat was exposed to, the more the tumor shrink. Now that's interesting because of two things. It connects to Dr. Soberg and
Yep.
BAT sucking up
Mm-hmm.
glucose and tumors
Mm-hmm.
feed off of glucose,
Mm-hmm.
most do. And so that connects to her, but also connects to
Totally.
Wim and his
Yep.
claims saying that it could
Mm-hmm.
help cure cancer. And
Totally.
I've heard so many anecdotes. I don't know about yourself, but I've heard so many anecdotes about people curing their cancer or suppressing their tumor growth
Mm-hmm.
through cold
Yeah.
exposure. So how does that
This
fit
was
in?
Nobel Prize winning research, right? This was not like, oh, did I lose you? Oh, you're still here.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, this was Nobel Prize winning research. Like this was real research, and they're looking at the Warburg effect, which is the idea that tumors suck up glucose, right? And they use glucose to fuel their growth. And if you can find a way to suck out glucose from the system, you might be able to retard tumor growth. That is an amazing finding. We've known about the Warburg effect for a long time, and so this study was. I'm pretty sure it won a Nobel Prize. It's actually been a long time since I've read that study or did that video.
Wow.
So whatever I said in the video was accurate, and whatever I'm saying right now is my memory of doing that video. So please just keep that in mind as I talk about this. Um, but this Warburg effect, if you can activate it, and they've been trying to activate this for a long time, that could be a very, very useful mechanism to attack cancer. And they're trying it with pharmaceutical development, but this also idea was maybe cold exposure could do it. Great. That's an awesome finding. And I've also heard anecdotes of people stopping cancer with either fasting or with cold exposure or lots of other protocols. The problem is that, well, why are we not doing controlled studies on cold exposure and cancer? Like, why are we not doing that to be sure? Because anecdotes are not evidence, even if you've got a lot of anecdotes, because who's telling the anecdote and how do you know that it wasn't, they were also taking their chemotherapy at the time? So, oh, and oftentimes it is like that. Like oftentimes,
Mm,
because ethically, we're not supposed to tell people to get off chemotherapy, right? You don't
mm,
actually want to like say half of you might die, and because we're not giving you any real treatment, and the other half are taking this active thing.
mm,
So how do we know? Someone may have been doing cold water exposure and taking their cancer treatments, and then attributed it to cold water. And well, let's go figure that out. Like let's find a way to make a study that is accurate that everyone will look at, and it can't cost more than $1 billion to do it. And $1 billion, we fart out $1 billion on things all the time. So let's do the study on humans and figure it out, because I think that would be excellent. And honestly, you'll probably find someone out there who will say, "Look, I know you can probably find a community of people who like, I will do the cold water exposure and not do my chemo treatment. And I understand that this may not work. And you can probably get their informed consent to do it and study those people. Why not? Like this is what we used to do in studies in the 20s and 30s, and
mm.
where we were like, well, if you die, you die, but we got great data. And then we have this ethical conundrum in the present day. We're like, well, maybe we shouldn't kill people for science, which I agree with, but maybe you can find people who would voluntarily do it, and with the knowledge that it could be total bullshit.
Mm.
And why not activate that idea? I'm not a scientist. I'm not on an ethics board. Maybe what I'm saying is bullshit, but consider it, FDA.
Okay. And then also, I also heard Dr. Otto say that rats have different metabolic
Totally.
processes, right? So we are not equal to rats. So just because
Mm-hmm.
a rat can do it doesn't mean that a human can as well. And that explanation lines up with everything we've mentioned
Mm-hmm.
as well. Okay. So for the last topic is Dr. Andrew Huberman. This is a difficult subject for me to talk about because I'm a fanboy. I'm not gonna lie. Like I'm just gonna put plain
Sure.
out. I
Mm-hmm.
don't. I may have put him on a pedestal. Okay. I really have a lot of trust in him.
Mm-hmm.
And when this or not scandal, but this article on the New York Post came out.
New York Magazine.
New York Magazine, sorry.
Correct.
It really kind of shook me a little bit. So tell me about what's the big issue that's going on, the big controversy right now that everyone's talking about with Dr.
So
Huberman.
there's two controversies with Andrew Huberman, and I think we should keep them separate for now.
Hmm.
One, I think they're related, but I think we can talk about them separately. One is that he had a lot of affairs and was generally a douchebag, like mean to women. I've spoken to the women. I know the women. I know that they're anonymous currently on the internet, but I know them because I've talked to them and I've interviewed them. And he was an asshole to them, and he was an asshole to me at various points. Whatever. There's this personal side that which maybe you can say is irrelevant. That's cool. I disagree, but that's cool. The other side, though, is his science. And let's actually talk about his science. He is an expert at cherry picking data. He will frequently come on to his show and pick someone like Susanna Soberg and declare her the best scientist on cold exposure ever. And note that she's only written 2 papers. The paper that she's known for sucks. And she immediately stopped becoming a scientist and started selling a course. Like, that's all really problematic. And he picks up controversial people, controversial scientists, and then says this person who's way outside the mainstream is the actual scientific answer to something. And so when we think about what a consensus is in science, you think about a lot of scientists coming together, taking data, removing data, peer reviewing, and trying to figure out some sort of truth. And it's, maybe that truth is like not a line, not like one arrow at one topic. Maybe it's like sort of like a thing like that instead of like this. He picks people who are controversial, even in that scientific consensus, and says that person is smarter than the consensus, and then gives health advice. And it's health advice, right? He's telling you what to do. He's telling you protocols on what to do. Here's the Huberman protocol on cold exposure, on breath work, on looking at the sun and whatever. He's got these things that he tells you to do based on small data sets, scientists that aren't generally, I mean, some of them are respected in the field. Like, he's got a lot of podcast hosts. I'm not going to say that everything he's ever done is bad. But I will say that, let's say that he's 80% on target. Let's say he's 80%, oh no, this checks out. But 20% is fucking flim-flam, like just got nothing to it. If he's giving you these protocols, how do you know what truth is? Like, how do you know what actually is going on if he's presenting it as like he's the science communicator? And I think he's really smart. I knew him reasonably well, not like the best, but I knew him reasonably well before he was famous. In like 2017, 2018, 2019, we were in each other's orbits. And then he got famous, and then, he got famous, and we didn't really talk all that much. He's really smart. He's an associate professor of ophthalmology and neuroscience. And he's published in Nature. He's published in Cell Reports Medicine. He's like, if you want to know what happens when you sever the optic nerve and watch it grow back, like, he's the guy. But I don't go to a physicist to ask the physicist about molecular biology. I don't go to a molecular biologist to talk about epidemiology. Like, scientists are experts in one narrow field, and they can be very, very smart people. But Einstein was not a psychiatrist, right? Like, just because he was like the smartest guy in the world doesn't mean that he's expertise in everywhere. And I think what Andrew Huberman has become is a generalized expert on everything to people. And that's like the opposite of what the concept of a scientific consensus is. The concept of scientific consensus is like, we're trying to figure out, it's sort of like a somewhat democratic. It's sort of like a messy figuring it out. But what Huberman offers you is order and the answer. He proffers this to you as like, look, I've sorted through this science and I will tell you what it is. But he doesn't have any more expertise in that stuff than I do, right? Like, yeah, I am never going to be like, let me tell you about the optic nerve. So maybe a sun protocol is great because that like directly involves the optic nerve. Like, maybe that's great.
Yeah.
But I can tell you his cold research sucks. I can tell you the person he endorses for cold, because I that is an area that I feel like I do have a level of expertise in, having written some books about that stuff. I feel like I'm at least conversant, and I'm at least as knowledgeable as Andrew Huberman in this. I feel like I'm more correct than him because I'm more measured in it. I'm more like, I don't know. And he's like, he issues these protocols, like, this is what you do, this is what you do, this is what you do. And I find that really, if you're going to issue a science-based protocol and you say that this is the method, then extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and present the evidence. if you actually, he often says he cites papers, then you look in his show notes and there are no papers there. And you're like, or the papers say the exact opposite of what he's saying. Like, it's
Hmm.
frequent. So there was actually just an article by Dr. Andrea Love, who's a PhD immunologist. It was in Slate magazine, came out yesterday, where she breaks down many things that Huberman gets wrong, where he's way out. And she talks about the Robert Lustig interview, which I actually didn't listen to. So, but she says that he is the outlier when talking about sugar and
Hmm.
insulin. Like, he is like very controversial in the space. He's like the one climate change denier among a bunch of people who are like, no, climate change is
Interesting.
happening. Look outside.
Interesting.
So,
Wow.
so look at her paper. Don't just hear what I'm saying. Look at her
Yeah.
paper and just and she cites a ton of studies, which I didn't read every single one of them. I read her Slate articles, like, and I like her because I know her and she's very measured. So that's my feeling about her.
Okay. Yeah, I think with the personal stuff, I don't know. I think for me, I think I can separate science from the scientists. I mean, like I said, take my stuff with a grain of salt because I am a big fan of him. But when it comes to the actual science, that's when my ears perked up, and I was like, wait, Huberman is supposed to be this paragon of rationality and being measured and careful with what he says. I mean, that's certainly the image that he projects that I've noticed. I mean, he looks straight into the camera. He announces that he's a
Mm-hmm,
professor. I mean, all these
mm-hmm,
science words, like you're saying. And I think, I mean, like you said, 80% of it might be correct and measured, but 20% of it is not and could be outlier information or information that is not accurate or not in line with the scientific consensus. And I think it's important that we have an error correction mechanism. I mean, again, it's not yes and, it's a yes but, and it's
mm-hmm.
okay to have that, especially with Dr. Andrew Huberman. And I think, yeah, I think that's important, and it's important work, even though it emotionally might feel difficult for a lot of people, as well as myself. We have to be in line with the truth. So
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting. So Susanna Soberg is one, obviously, an issue, as we've pointed out, that her studies may not be what she's claiming, and she's selling courses, so there's scientific conflicts there, and he was
Mm-hmm.
endorsing her. So I can see how that's definitely is an issue. And so I'll check out this immunologist as well. I think he also had an episode out on oral health recently, and I think he actually
Mm-hmm.
got some pushback in the comments about it, saying, you're a neuroscientist and an ophthalmologist. Why are you speaking about oral health? And I think there was a pushback. I don't know if this was people commenting or him replying, saying that he does his research and talks to experts within the field at Stanford because he's surrounded by a bunch of smart
Sure. Yeah.
professors,
Great.
and
Great
then
resource to
presents,
have. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
presents the information. So, what's your, I guess, response to that, if you have any?
I'm not an expert on oral health. I will say that he's came out against fluoride. And when you come out
Hmm.
against fluoride, there's a long history of people who do not like fluoride, right?
Yeah.
Long history because it, let's see, government mind control, or it calcifies your pineal gland, or where are we now? Or it like the actual mechanism why fluoride is bad changes throughout the conspiracy
Hmm.
theory's life, right? And and we just don't like fluoride because we're being dosed with it without our permission. And so he's playing in to an established narrative about why fluoride is bad and dangerous. Um, on the other hand, we've been drinking fluoride in our water since what, the 60s? Like, you'd think that if there was a big epidemiological problem, we would know, like, we've run the biggest study we've ever possibly done. And I'm not
Hmm.
seeing a lot of people dying of fluoride toxicity. I'm just not seeing that. He's also said things like, if you put sunscreen on, the sunscreen is detectable in your blood or in your cells 10 years later or 25 years later. And how would you even test that? Like, what controlled study told you you put on sunscreen 10 years ago once, and now we're testing it today and we found it in your cells? It makes no sense. That claim is just out there. And I also want to
Hmm.
point out that his personal life, while his sexual practices may not matter, like, whatever, he's involved in the BDSM scene, cool, like, go have great sex. Like, as long as consensual, it's all great. Who cares? But if you are, and he's a serial cheater, like I think that's established. I think that's pretty obvious that he serially cheats on women.
Mm,
Um, that involves lying to people. That involves methodical lying. Like, the internet's like all so happy that he had 6 girlfriends at once, and they've said, oh, you should do a scheduled cheating protocol because you're so good at it. But like, if you're a liar in one field and you're manipulative, like really, really manipulative in one field, why do we assume that he can firewall it off as well as his audience can firewall it? I know bad people out there who are manipulative in all genres of his life. And I will say personally, he was very manipulative to me. He was I've seen him fucking angry, like spitting red angry. Like I've
mm,
seen this
mm,
personally in him. And I think that someone's character matters. I also think that let's talk about conflicts of interest. If he's presenting science to you and he's saying, here's my here's my protocol on whatever, and buy Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is a great supplement, and you should go take this. And I'm also drinking matcha, right? He owns the matcha company, and he gets. I've heard it's about a $20 million a year sponsorship from Athletic Greens. If you're one of those people who's like money can influence you, then apply that to Andrew Huberman. Like if you believe that there is a possibility of a financial conflict of interest where you are literally receiving money from someone to sponsor a product and sponsor a protocol, like he gets sponsored by Plunge, right? Like why wouldn't he tell you that
mm.
plunging is a great idea? Why wouldn't he say that whatever Athletic Greens does is a good idea? He is promoting something and he's literally getting paid. It's not even hidden. He's saying it.
Yeah.
So why do we go out and be like, hey, big pharma's in it for the money? Like they're just out there trying to cash in because COVID vaccine or whatever you want to say. Big pharma's got issues, man. I ain't gonna go
Yeah.
out there and defend
Yeah.
big pharma. But why is he an exception to that? Like how do we pull him out just because he looks straight at the camera and tells you with a straight face? Like shit, like if that's all I need to do, then what? And we're also so mad about at accountability. We're like, hey, look at all these side effects with these big pharma problems. Like this drug has killed a lot of people and there's malpractice. Like the reason we know this is because there's something called reporting, and they are held accountable by a regulatory agency called the FDA. And then we point at those problems to be like, look, those people died too, or those people had negative outcomes too. Yes, they did, and the transparency is part of it. With the
Mm,
Huberman and with the wellness industry, with the what, like $4 trillion wellness industry, like there is money there, and honestly, a lot of those supplement companies are owned by pharmaceutical companies. So that we need to be able to take this stuff with a grain of salt. We need to apply our critical thinking whenever we get like a person who looks straight at the camera and tells you something. And if you don't believe me, fine. Like I will look at straight at the camera at you too and say, fact check me. Like I told you about the study with Andrea Love. Go read her article. And maybe a lot of people are really upset at the Huberman article, and there's so many different comments out there saying that I don't care about this. Well, or it's a hit piece or whatever. Well, read the article. Like don't
mm.
read someone else's view of it, because a lot of people are commenting just because other people said it was a hit piece. Fine, maybe it's
Yeah.
a hit piece. Read it. If you feel so
Yeah.
strongly about it, read it. It's 5,000 words or 8,000 words. If you think of yourself as a serious person, then read it and then tweet your piece.
Yeah.
And then I'll have more respect for whatever you might have to say.
And I think there's this image when people watch your videos, I see the comments, they think you're just doing this for attention. When you're calling out Huberman or Wim Hof or Soberg, oh, you're just trying to do this so you can sell what you're selling as well. But this is your job. You're an investigative journalist. You've been doing this from way before. So we have to keep that in mind. This is what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to end on a final question, really, is what is I mean, I don't really know anything about journalism. I think most of those people who are commenting might not know what these journalistic practices. So what is a hit piece? What's the definition of it? What constitutes a hit piece and what doesn't, do you think?
I,
And
I think a hit piece in modern terminology is a piece you don't like. A
Yeah.
piece about someone that feels awkward that you don't like.
Yeah.
I think maybe, obviously journalism has a complicated history. The media is not in a great place right now. I will admit that there are some major institutional problems going on for sure. We can't deny that. But we can also say that journalists go out there and they interview lots of people. They look at a large number of facts. They are
Mm.
beholden to something called libel laws where they're fucking afraid of getting sued. Like I know Carrie Howley, because I was interviewed in the piece, like I'm quoted in the piece. So I actually had some insight to what they were doing. And there was
Mm.
a lot of information that was not printed in that piece that I heard because I talked to these people that was fucking crazy shit. And I'm sure it's going to come out in like a week or two. But they didn't put it in because they're like, okay, well, this might be libelous and whatever. They have fact checkers. So they called me, not Carrie Howley called me, but an independent person called me and was like, did you say this? Did you say this? Did you say this? Is this back upable? Like, can you show me documentation? Yes,
Mm.
we provide all that material. It doesn't
Okay.
always get printed because there's no requirement to print everything you have because you can actually violate someone's um, safety. Like the women are all anonymous, and I personally feel like they shouldn't be. Some of these women, you can find out who they are by just some savvy Googling. Like there's no secret about that. But the women are terrified of being attacked by the millions of people who are in Huberman's corner who don't even read the piece and are just like those women are deserve to be denigrated or they deserve to be discredited.
Yeah.
Like, and I feel like that's really, really problematic. Like Huberman is hired Scale Strategies, which is a very, very powerful PR firm. People say he hasn't responded because so far, as of today when we're recording, I don't believe Huberman has released a statement, but he has spent a lot of money on a white-shoed PR firm. It's the PR people who worked for WeWork, WeWork for their IPO, and WeWork's IPO we know was a shit show. WeWork was a shit show. And these people are actively manipulating Wikipedia pages because we can see that evidence. They're actively creating social media accounts and trying to change the discourse. They're leaking emails between Carrie Howley, the reporter, and Andrew Huberman, and they're putting it into certain pipelines. And
Mm.
maybe you could say, hey, is it so crazy that someone hired a PR firm? And no, that's fine. But like, if you're someone who is like conspiratorially minded and you think that there might be power acting in the background and trying to influence public opinion about things, I think we could start by looking at very highly paid PR firms because they're obviously involved in changing, and they're even called crisis PR. And
Mm.
these people might be able to act ethically, be like, look, here you should take a statement, and there's a way to behave responsibly. Or they could also work to change public opinion in ways that are maybe a little unfair as well.
Okay. Well, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with, the viewer with?
No, just stay skeptical. Like, you don't, if you don't like what I'm saying, then fact check me. Just read my stuff and actually engage with the material that is being said. Don't start at comments for anything that you're doing. Look at primary sources, look at people with direct experience, and start from there, not just sort of a hot take. Because otherwise, all you're doing is amplifying. You're playing that yes and game with people. Like, what is a retweet except a yes and? Right? What is that? Like all you're doing is amplifying perspectives that may not be honest. And there's a lot of reason to think that people are not being honest. And I am an author. I have books behind me. If you want to buy my books, please buy my books. Like I'm not hiding the fact that I'm a journalist. Like for sure, like that's what journalists do. And I will say that I am not in this for the money because the money's in yes anding. Like if I wanted to make money right now, I would get a lot more views by saying Andrew Huberman has been fucked over by women and
Mm.
you need to be skeptical because that is what drives viewership more than anything else. Same with Wim Hof. Like I should not be going out with him because I've seen my book sales go down by 40% at least, and I'm still doing it. Like I even have like transparency. Like you can look at my videos. I did a video about how much I make, and I just showed you my money income statement. And I've
Yeah.
made like, I don't know, I think on YouTube, I think I've made like I want to say it's like somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000 over the last year. That's money that could influence me for sure. $9,000 to $11,000 is money. Andrew Huberman makes like 20 million. Who has more reasons to tell the truth, to change, tell the truth and change their opinion? I mean, yeah, follow the money. Be skeptical of things. If Andrew Huberman wants to show you how much money he makes, that's my challenge to him right now. Andrew Huberman, show me your bank statements, show me your stuff, and I'll show you mine. Like, great, let's go do it.
Okay. Well, Scott, I know it's a freaking tornado, storm that's going on right now, and you're caught right in the middle of it. You were mentioned in that article, but again, again a person who really looks up to Huberman, I want to say that we should never put people on a pedestal, and I feel like because we put this person on a pedestal, that 20% issue or any kind of issue that arises, it becomes a big fall. These are valuable human beings we're dealing with. And I want to keep asking questions and still being skeptical, like you're saying. But I just want to thank you for doing the work that you're doing. And you may not get a lot of praise or get a lot of book sales or any of this, but I do think it really is genuinely important. And we'll see what happens in the long run, but I just want to say thank you. So.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on and spreading the message and being skeptical, because you don't have to agree with me. You really don't. Like, you may find that some things I say didn't land with you, right? And that's great. At least you're thinking about it.
Awesome. Thank you.